Welcome to The Road. This is a weekly podcast of All Saints Lutheran Church. I'm your host, John Pedersen, and I serve as pastor. Each week, we reflect on faith, life, and navigating the road ahead. The language of journey is common when we think about life. It has its joys and challenges along the way, and we all need a little encouragement and guidance at times to keep us going. There's a word in the Bible, asphalia, which means truth, but it's the same root word we use in English for asphalt, if you can believe that. It's a solid surface that makes travel easier and more assured. And so every week we're going to be exploring elements of faith and life that keep us on the road. Faith isn't about living a perfect life. It's about finding our way, getting through rough spots, but seeking out those great vistas too. You can find my weekly message here, but you'll also find special conversations with guests who have insights on things like wellness, parenting, and living with unique purpose. If you appreciate this podcast, remember to subscribe where possible and share it with a friend. Here's this week's message. Well, on a bit of a different note, as many of you know, football season is over in Minnesota, sadly. The Vikings didn't make it past the first round of the playoffs. One of the features, though, of our defense over the past couple of years has been a scheme in which not all players have rigid positions and roles as in many traditional defenses. Some of our defenders transition back and forth between linebacker and cornerback and safety and edge rusher. All of that within a game or sometimes even within a play. And that requires a lot of skill, football IQ, and additional effort. And not every player can do that effectively. Some players might resist this approach because taking on other positions isn't what they were trained for or what they're particularly good at. But if you're all in and you're being asked to do it, would you do it? Flexibility and commitment to achieving a goal in an organization or endeavor are values discussed in corporate teams, nonprofits, disaster responses, and sometimes even families. There are times when everyone needs to contribute, even if it's not your job. When you're invested and you care and a new situation or dilemma presents itself, are you willing to step it up? That's a question that I want you to keep in mind as we explore today's story about Jesus at the wedding in Cana. And I want you to understand more about what's at stake for Jesus in deciding to help the wedding family in a situation that might have seemed outside of his mission. The miracle of turning water into wine is the first of 7 specific signs or miracles of Jesus in John's gospel. And these 7 signs offer a glimpse into the divine power of Jesus and reveal who he is. But they also function almost as the hours on a kind of clock. When midnight strikes, so to speak, the ministry of Jesus will be effectively over. There are, in this case, not 12 hours or 24 hours, but 7 in biblical terms conveys completeness and fullness. Each click of the clock reveals who he is and builds momentum and faith among people. John notes this in the final verse of today's gospel when he says, Jesus did this, the first of his signs in Cana of Galilee, and revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. But as much as these signs ignite amazement and faith, this widening realization of his identity by more and more people also simultaneously raises opponents. He becomes more of a threat to those who cannot allow a charismatic figure in Messiah to emerge in an authoritarian empire. So with that context, Jesus really hasn't started his ministry yet apart from gathering some disciples. The minute that clock moves and clicks for the first time, then the timer has started and his time becomes limited. For reasons both human and strategic, it's as if Jesus, in resisting a bit of his mother's request, wants to delay the start of his ministry. It's a human instinct and understandable. Jesus conveys this in his kind of irritated response when he says, "Woman, what concern is that to me and to you? My hour is not yet come." Jesus doesn't appear to see this small request as worthy of starting the clock or perhaps worthy of using his divine powers at all. It's as if Jesus holds an ideal in terms of how he will use his power in more consequential or spiritual matters and what will serve his mission best. But we see Jesus now wrestling with this divine ideal and what is being asked of him in this very real human and concrete situation. This is what God being incarnate looks like. When God comes in human form in Jesus, the question is, what is that going to look like? Will the Son of God kind of move around in like this little protective bubble in the world but not truly engaged? Or is the Son of God all in? Does Jesus allow himself to be impacted by the people around him and shaped by requests and relationships? One approach is real engagement, and the other, not as much. There were and are notions about what an all-powerful, all-knowing, and omnipotent God should choose. One ancient answer came in the centuries after Jesus from some who called themselves Gnostics. Out of that movement came some of the so-called alternate gospels you hear about sometimes. They were intrigued by Jesus as a divine figure, but they ultimately rejected many of the biblical stories because they didn't portray God as they wanted. Instead, the Gospels showed Jesus, Son of God, as exactly the kind of Messiah that we're talking about today, one who came into the world and, in the eyes of Gnostics at least, tarnished himself with ordinary human affairs rather than maintaining a kind of separation and distance from it all, remaining above it all. Today's story about the wedding points us to a Son of God who is willing to enter into the particularities, and some might even say absurdities, of the human situation. So let me say more about this particular situation today and why it's compelling and why his mother Mary is asking him to help out the wedding couple and change water into wine. Weddings at that time were multi-day celebrations. Wine was a central part of it. One biblical scholar observes that given the climate, lack of clean water, large number of guests, and sustained duration of ancient wedding feasts, the lack of wine at this wedding was a serious problem. The inability to provide what the guests needed was a failure in hospitality that would bring shame on the wedding hosts. This is not a matter of life and death or salvation for that matter, but it was a crisis for this couple. In fact, the same scholar notes that it was an ancient custom for guests to bring wedding gifts in the form of food and drink to share the burden of providing for such a large group. So the family's lack of wine may indicate a lack of community support in addition to their own lack of resources. So Mary's plea with Jesus to help in a way only he can do is an effort to support this wedding couple and honor them within the community. But is this his job and his mission? Is this why Jesus was born and came into the world, to make more wine? By performing this miracle, people will start to see who he is. Word will spread, the clock will start ticking, all because of this. Woman, what concern is that to me and to you? My hour has not yet come. How will Jesus ultimately be present in the world? How will the incarnation, God in flesh, play out? Mary says to the servants in the room, do whatever he tells you. Moms know what to say without really saying it, right? And so Jesus turns 120 to 180 gallons of water into wine. It's an incredible amount, nothing held back. There's almost an absurdity to the amount of wine. In Luke 7, Jesus later points out the critiques of him by religious leaders that may have come out of this miracle. He says, John the Baptist has come eating no bread and drinking no wine, and you say, he has a demon. And the Son of Man, and he's referring to himself, has come eating and drinking, and you say, look, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. People often just choose to trust or not, and then look for evidence to confirm their preconceptions. That was as true then as it is today. But Jesus was never shown to have a problem with drinking alcohol. But a story like the wedding in Cana may have inspired stories. Was the miracle really worth it? That's essentially the question Jesus is asking Mary in this story. Why do you want me to get involved in this? I love how John shares this very human and divine struggle to help us better see the implications of incarnation, the perplexities of being truly present. His mother has made a request. What will he do? And we'll see in coming weeks as Jesus starts his ministry that he's not infinitely flexible. He won't be bullied or allow his mission to be turned inward or kept only for a few. But here in this story, we see that Jesus, the one born in Bethlehem and called Son of God and Messiah, is in relationship with the people around him. The light come into the world is not just an impermeable, unaffected light floating above us all. Real movements require personal investment. They call upon us to find our heart and what really matters and to be present in a more profound way than simply saying, that's not my job. Nobody trained me for that. It might make me look bad if I get outside my comfort zone. The truth is that personal investment does leave us vulnerable to some extent, which is very different for us in thinking about the Son of God, one who is vulnerable rather than all-powerful, isn't it? When Jesus showed up for the wedding couple in the flesh, it was only the start of something bigger that would lead to many other challenges, including the way of the cross. It was human for Jesus to pause and question whether it was worth it, whether it was on mission, and whether it was the right timing. It's a trepidation and hesitation that I've experienced, one that probably we all do. It never fully goes away, and many times we may opt out of a call to invest ourselves more fully into some task. But in this first sign in Cana of Galilee, and in many of the stories to come, we see that in the final equation, Jesus cared about people. He puts aside whatever divine ideal he may have had in this situation and cares for the couple in their moment of need, even if it seemed outside of his responsibility. It's faithful to ask whether something is in line with God's mission. The movement Jesus started points to many ideals and a spirit at the heart of it all, which we should seek to follow. But at its heart, it's about people. It's about showing care for our neighbor, even in extravagant and absurd ways. And so if we find ourselves struggling with a particular endeavor, whether something we're doing is on mission or not, but we're caring for the people around us, then we have company in Jesus. Amen. That's this week's message. You don't have to navigate the road ahead alone. You can join with others at All Saints. Visit allsaintsmtka.org for more information. Have a great week.